At her husband's funeral, not a single child came. Not her son, not her daughter, not even a phone call. That afternoon, Evelyn Grant stopped grieving and began rewriting her will. Evelyn Grant stood beneath the chapel's high ceiling, as if beneath a sky, and felt very small. The funeral director cleared his throat twice, a sound meant to fill awkward spaces. But even that practiced noise could not hide the way the room felt: hollow rows of polished wood, hymn sheets waiting like unread letters, and a scattering of lilies that looked too furious in their whiteness. She had dressed thoughtfully, a simple black suit, a string of pearls that Robert had given her on an anniversary 25 years ago. Sensible shoes she could walk down 1,000 steps in if she had to. She thought it would be enough. She thought grief, in its proper etiquette, required the presence of children, of faces that remembered together. She had imagined their shoulders brushing as they passed the hymnals, their voices catching as the pallbearers lowered the casket. She had imagined wrong. The first pew, always reserved for family, sat empty save for the single chair where she planted herself like an anchor. She did not cry. The steady ache she'd carried since Robert's last week in the hospital did not map itself into salt or fever today. It folded into something quieter and more crystalline. Understanding that bent into her bones. A pastor. Read scripture with the voice of someone who had said these words many times. They hung in the air like familiar furniture. The funeral director asked, "Shall we begin?" And she said yes, because Robert would have disliked delay, disliked fuss. He liked punctuality. Even the clock of his life had wound itself on routine. Messages had come earlier, curt, practical. Daniel sent a one-line text at dawn: "Sorry, can't make it. Important meeting." Celia had posted a brunch photo at 11, laughing with friends beneath a caption that read, "Bottomless mimosas. Living our best lives." No calls, no arrangements, no small, human clutterflowers. A hand that had knuckled her shoulder in the old way. Evelyn watched the pallbearers lower the casket and felt the earth swallow him with a legal clinical indifference. Stood nearby, hands on a spade, as if the world had not stopped but rearranged itself without notice. The pastor said the last prayer. If there was an absence of music, the silence itself sang the loudest hymn, Neglect. When the minister finished, the funeral director murmured, "We'll wait a few more minutes in case anyone else arrives." Evelyn, who had become adept at making practical decisions, said no. She did not need extra minutes. She had said her goodbyes in the small rooms of the hospice, in the hospital alcove where Robert's hand had gone slack in hers. She had said them in the tiny ways you say goodbye long before a casket closes. The soft routine of folding his shirts, the way she had brushed his hair the last morning. Today, there would be ceremony, but no transformation. Outside, the wind tugged at her coat and seemed to scold like a neighbor's whisper. A few townspeople lingered, eyes wide with pity, offering small condolences that felt like thin paper. Evelyn accepted each one with the politeness of years. Then she walked back through the empty chapel, across polished floors that remembered footsteps but not the names of those meant to leave them. She had married Robert when they were young and debtless, certain of a future that would be built, step by step, with thrift and stubbornness. They had weathered lean years and small triumphs to children. The lake cabin, the oak they planted behind the house. Over decades, the routine had become a tapestry. His early paper, her careful accounts, the ritual of pie on Sundays. They had built things together without realizing how easily quiet could be mistaken for gratitude. Now, standing alone by the coffin, Evelyn felt the balance shift. The ledger of a life was more than memory. There were papers, accounts, wills, details tucked behind books and in locked drawers. Robert had been tidy with his life and meticulous with his affairs. She thought of the folder she and their attorney had filed 3 years ago, simple instructions. Trust matters, the kind of legal housekeeping they did with the same seriousness they'd brought to balancing the checkbook. If grief had left a small, precise tool in her hand, it was practicality. She left the chapel without speaking to anyone further, the echo of her sensible shoes on the steps sounding like punctuation. At home, the house was neat in the way a life arranged for two can be his slippers side by side. The newspaper folded at 6, the remote where he had last set it. She opened a bottle of wine she had kept for guests and poured a glass for herself because guests had been conspicuously absent. On social media, the world had not been feeling her loss. Celia's brunch photo scrolled past in her hand with laughter frozen forever at someone else's table. Daniel's driver's swing flashed across another frame. Sunlight caught on a fairway as if the grave could be ignored by the scorecard of life. Evelyn set the phone down and felt the coolness of a moment resolved into clarity. She had been invisible to them, not out of malice, but out of convenience. When she reached for the kitchen drawer, she found the folder labeled estate thin, neat, rubber-banded the papers. Inside were the ones lawyers love: wills, beneficiary lists, the small mechanical proofs of who receives what when someone stops being present. Her hands trembled when she opened it, not with fear but a sharp, steady outrage at the ledger of obligation they had accepted for years. She read each line as if reading minutes of an enterprise that had been mismanaged in private. Evelyn did not let tears fall then. She looked at the portraits on the wall: Robert with a fishing rod, Daniel with a graduation cap, Celia midlaugh at a wedding, and understood that devotion had been assumed into thin air. The funeral had been the proof. In the hush that settled. After the last guests left, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and made a choice that felt less like revenge and more like pruning. For years she had given without limits. She had been, as she sometimes joked to friends, a living safety net. Today she decided to stop being invisible. She made a call to the attorney's office. The voice that had been patient for decades, picking up with its usual formal warmth. "Thomas Hale," she said, giving her name and asking for an appointment to revise the papers. It sounded simple. It was everything. The law office smelled of eucalyptus polish and the kind of quiet that suggests patience and time. Thomas Hale greeted Evelyn with the easy courtesy of a man who had known many family stories and the durable fact that some families are legal documents in motion. "You look composed," he said, closing a folder. "But you sounded resolved on the phone." Evelyn sat straight. She had practiced composure like a skill. "I would like to amend the will," she said. "Remove Daniel and Celia as beneficiaries." Thomas regarded her with the look of a professional parsing an unusual request. "That's a significant shift." "It's necessary," she replied. "They didn't come." She told him about the empty pews, about the brunch photo and the text message. She did not need to dramatize. Facts had a way of being moving enough on their own. They spoke about legal constructs, trusts, irrevocable arrangements, safeguards against claims. Thomas moved through options carefully. "You could set up a trust for your grandson, Ethan. Make the distribution contingent on his education, his stability. It would be difficult to contest if structured properly." Evelyn thought of Ethan, quiet, kind. The teenager who once mowed her lawn unasked and returned library books with a shy grin. He had been the only one in the family not to treat grief as an optional inconvenience. "Yes," she said, "set it up so he can't be manipulated, not by credit cards or by parents' sudden interest." "It will require evidence of prudent planning," Thomas said, "and some clear language." She smiled once, small and unromantic. "Then let's be precise." When she left the office with drafts in a neat stack, the air outside tasted sharp with autumn. She carried the papers like a coat folded over her arm. The change would not erase Serrano legal instrument could, but it would redraw lines. She had discovered that the last generosity of a life should not be spent on people who had been practicing absence. Back home, Evelyn opened the file cabinet and spread records across the kitchen table. Canceled checks, mortgage statements, letters, and the quiet, damning ledger of years she had been asked to solve problems with no interest in the person behind them. For decades, she had been the one to call. A leaky roof, a tuition fee, a hush money for career turbulence. The list went on. She had done this because she thought that is what mothers do: scaffold, maintain, make life functional. Now, she saw the pattern as something else entirely: an economy of taking with polite receipts. She boxed up old cards and trinkets, handmade macaroni frames, the childish crowns of a different errand, placed them into a cardboard storage bin. This was not cruelty. It was a clearing. She wanted space. She had no desire to keep objects that had become placeholders for duty. The house needed room to breathe. That evening, Ethan knocked on the back door. He had driven over after finishing an evening shift at the community center. He arrived unannounced, the way the young sometimes do, carrying a pizza and an earnest face. "Grandma," he said, and that single word, earnest and unadorned, felt like superlative music. They ate in the kitchen, and Evelyn watched him with a new softness. He asked about small things: how the coffee machine worked, where she kept the spare light bulbs. He did not ask where the estate would go or who would receive what. He simply sat with the practical attentiveness of someone who wanted to be near. After dishes were done, he rose to leave and paused. "Grandma," he asked, "do you want me to come by tomorrow and help prune the roses? I can bring gloves?" Evelyn felt a tug in her chest. "Yes, Ethan, that would be lovely." When he left, he hugged her a brief, awkward embrace that belonged in the space between boy and man, and she felt something in her clothes like a latch opening. He had not been enticed by the prospect of inheritance. He had shown up because sometimes people know to show up when others have stopped asking. The next morning, she sent a formal notice instructing Thomas to proceed. She signed the amended will with the steady, deliberate hand of someone who had attended 2 bills. 2 real estate to the small mechanical duties of running a life. She appointed safeguards, trustees, and a plan that would keep the home safe for Ethan while preventing opportunists from prying. It felt administrative and sacred. A letter arrived a week later, a thin, defensive note from Celia that said, "I hope you reconsider. The family needs to stay united." Another from Daniel asked for a meeting, his tone oddly measured as if he had been coached in contrition. Evelyn read them both and considered replying, instructing Thomas to engage legally. But then she folded the letters carefully and placed them in the drawer. She'd sealed an act of cataloging, not of burning. She was not cruel. She was precise. She had been kind for years. Now she would be just neighbors brought casseroles and murmured their sympathies. And Lorraine, who lived down the street, stopped by with lemon shortbread and a blunt, bracing honesty. "You did right," she said, with the kind of certainty friendship grants. Evelyn allowed the comfort and stored it away like dry wood for later. Warmth. Days became tidy. Garden work with Ethan, small tasks that mattered because they were chosen and not demanded. Paperwork with Thomas, slow afternoons reading the books she'd shelved for others' needs. She slept better in a way she had not known in years, no longer on edge, waiting for the next phone call demanding money or favor. Peace, she learned, had a texture. It was not triumphal. It was ordinary and clean, like a well-made bed. When the judge signed the final acknowledgement of the trust months later, Evelyn felt a quiet settling. The spotlight of the world did not turn toward her. No grand declaration changed anyone's life overnight. Instead, small things rearranged. A neighbor who checked the gutters, a grandson who learned the right way to prune roses, a house that slowly shifted from a place of duty into a sanctuary. Evelyn kept a small note in a drawer, the first line of a letter she had written to herself in the nights after the funeral. "You tried longer than you should have. You bent yourself into shapes to make others comfortable. Now, you have earned the right to be comfortable yourself." She read it sometimes, like a pledge. In time. The hollow pew in the chapel became memory, sharp but not poisonous. She would visit the cemetery on soft afternoons, leave a cluster of wildflowers where Robert lay. She forgave in that quiet way older women forgive. Not to absolve the absent, but to free herself from their weight. Her life, she decided, would be measured now in presence law. Steadfast acts that said louder than any will, "I will come when I am needed, and I will not be taken for granted." It was nearly a week after the funeral when Daniel Grant finally appeared at his mother's door. He hadn't called first. Evelyn knew the sound of his car long before the knock, the self-assured hum of an engine that hadn't known strain in years. When she opened the door, Daniel stood there in his tailored coat, phone in hand, as if halfway between errands. "Mom," he said, adjusting his cuff. "Can we talk?" His eyes darted over her shoulder, scanning the hall as though looking for something grander than her quiet home could offer. Evelyn stepped aside, not out of welcome, but out of politeness. The house still smelled faintly of lilies and polish, remnants of the funeral flowers that hadn't yet wilted. Daniel wrinkled his nose. "You still keeping those? Musty." "They're not for keeping," she said evenly, "just not ready to throw them away." He exhaled. "I wish you'd told me about the funeral earlier." "I would have." She cut him off gently. "I told you a week before." Danielle, he blinked, surprised by the calm precision in her tone. "Well, yeah, but work's been important," she finished for him. "I imagine it always is." He looked down, tapping at his phone before putting it away like a man surrendering a prop that wasn't working. "Look, Mom, I'm sorry, really, I just didn't think it would matter that much. Dad and I weren't exactly close." Evelyn studied him. He looked older than she remembered, not in the way time ages people, but in the way neglect ages relationships. There was something hollow about him now, like a suit pressed too often and too neatly. "I didn't ask you to be close," she said. "I asked you to come." He frowned, unused to confrontation in such small, contained doses. "I'm here now, aren't I?" She gave a faint smile. "And what brought you now?" He hesitated just a second too long. "Celia said you're making some changes to the will." There it was, the real reason. Not remorse, not reconciliation. Concern disguised as interest. Evelyn nodded. "Yes, I am." "Don't you think that's a bit?" Daniel asked, trying to sound reasonable. "I mean, we all grieve differently. Maybe Celia and I handled it badly, but we're still family." "Family," Evelyn repeated softly, The word tasting, unfamiliar? That word doesn't mean what you think it means. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. So what? You're punishing us? Cutting us off. Evelyn set the teapot down with careful grace. I'm simply giving what's left of my life to the people who showed up for it. He blinked, meaning Ethan. She didn't answer directly. He came, she said, without being asked. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his practiced charm faltering. He's a kid. He doesn't understand the value of money. Evelyn looked at him steadily. He understands the value of presence. You should try it sometime. Something flickered in his eyes, not guilt, not humility, but wounded pride. He rose abruptly. You've made your point. No, she said quietly. I've made my peace. He left without another word, the door closing softly behind him. Evelyn stood for a long moment in the empty hallway, listening to the silence that followed, clean, like air after rain. That evening, she called Patricia Hale's office and confirmed the revisions. Yes, she told the assistant, I'm certain. Proceed exactly as discussed. Her voice didn't shake. It carried the stillness of someone who had looked directly at love's absence and finally stopped apologizing for seeing it clearly. Snow arrived early that year, thin but deliberate, the kind that dusts rooftops like a memory rather than a season. Evelyn watched it through the kitchen window while waiting for the kettle to boil. The roses outside had already surrendered to the cold, their stems blackened, their petals curled inward like secrets. Robert used to prune them every November. She found herself missing the rhythm of it. The soft clip of shears, the small pile of what could no longer bloom. Ethan arrived that morning as promised, a pair of work gloves hanging from his pocket. Grandma, he said, stomping his boots on the porch, I brought salt for the steps. She smiled. You think of everything. He shrugged. Mom told me you shouldn't be out here alone. Thought I'd check. Evelyn arched an eyebrow. Did she? Now? He grinned sheepishly. Okay. Maybe she said, don't bother her. So I thought I should. Evelyn laughed, a real laugh that startled her with how light it sounded. I appreciate your rebellion. They spent the morning working side by side. Ethan trimmed the dead branches while she collected the cuttings. The air between them filled with small, ordinary conversation. He told her about school, about a volunteer program at the community garden, about how he wanted to study architecture but wasn't sure he could afford it. She listened, asking gentle questions that didn't pry. You know, she said, watching him stack the last of the branches. Your grandfather once said the secret to roses is knowing what to let die. Ethan paused. That's dark. It's true, she said, her breath fogging in the air. If you keep every branch, even the diseased ones, the whole thing rots. Life's like that too. You prune so something else can live. He nodded, understanding more than she expected. Guess that's what you're doing now, huh? She smiled faintly. I suppose it is. They finished their work and went inside for cocoa. The house, which had once felt like an echo chamber, seemed warmer somehow. Ethan moved icily in it, refilling the kettle, finding mugs, humming under his breath. He didn't belong there. Not in the way her children once did. But he didn't feel like a visitor either. There was no performance between them, no agenda. Before he left, he hesitated at the door. Grandma, yes, Mom's mad. About the will, I think. She said, you're cutting them out. Evelyn looked at him carefully. Do you think I'm wrong? He shook his head. I think you're brave. She touched his arm lightly. You remind me of your grandfather when you say things like that. Ethan smiled, a little embarrassed, and hugged her before stepping into the snow. She watched him walk down the path, leaving a neat trail of footprints that would disappear by morning. When the house was quiet again, she sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, and wrote a letter to Thomas confirming the trust structure for Ethan's education. Her handwriting was slow but elegant, the ink steady even as the weight of years sat behind each stroke. Ensure full protection from external claims, she wrote. No exceptions. When she finished, she looked out at the frozen garden and whispered to herself, you prune so something else can live. It wasn't anger that drove her anymore. It was clarity, the clean precision of a woman who finally understood the difference between generosity and depletion. That night, Evelyn dreamed of spring. The roses reblooming, Ethan laughing in sunlight, Robert's hand steady on hers. When she woke, there was frost on the windows, but warmth in her chest. The kind that comes not from forgiveness, but from freedom. By late winter, the house had a thin, hopeful light about it. Paperwork was filed. Trustees had been named. The trust for Ethan existed like a quiet promise in the bank. Still, the world beyond her kitchen window continued to orbit without much regard for Evelyn's new boundaries. News traveled slowly when it mattered most. It arrived with a soft, practiced knock of someone who hoped politeness would substitute for shame. Celia stood on the porch in a down coat that looked far too new for the season. A handbag slung just so, nails immaculate. She had the practiced stride of a woman who moved through rooms expecting them to rearrange themselves around her arrival. "Hi, Mom," Celia said, offering a smile like a greeting card. Evelyn let her in. They sat at the table that used to host holiday puzzles and school projects. Celia folded her hands as if about to negotiate. "I saw," she began, "about the will." "Yes," Evelyn said. "You did." Celia's smile tightened. "I don't understand why you would cut us out like that. After everything." "After what?" Evelyn asked softly. "After forgetting to come. After texts that said, 'Sorry, can't make it,' and brunch photos." She watched Celia's face shift through the stages she'd seen on many others. Confusion, irritation, then the familiar flash of defensiveness. "I did this because I wanted to give what's mine to someone who showed up without asking." Celia's voice rose, the practiced cadence of a woman who felt entitled to explanation. "That's not fair. We're family. You can't punish us for one mistake." "Not one mistake," Evelyn corrected, thinking of the incremental ledger of favors, of emergencies met without thanks, of years she'd smoothed the edges of their lives. "It wasn't a single day, Celia. It was a pattern. A life outside." The wind tugged at the eaves, as if impatient with family dramas. Celia's eyes filled slightly, not from grief, but from the sting of being called to account. "You don't have to make this so dramatic," she said at last. "Money doesn't change love." Evelyn folded her hands. "It reveals what already was." Celia stood abruptly, a small, controlled storm. "You'll regret this." She said it not as a plea, but as a promise. Evelyn watched as her daughter moved toward the door. "I won't," she said. "Not for what you think I need." Celia left without another word, her heels clicking a brief, angry syllable down the walk. Evelyn closed the door and rested her palm on the wood like calming a pulse. She had not wanted this spectacle, new appellate drama. No courtroom scenes of shame, but when one decides to prune a life, there will be leaves that fly off in protest. That afternoon, a letter arrived from Daniel. It was long, careful, apologies rehearsed in the passive voice. Mentions of obligations, of debts and pressures that sounded like rehearsed excuses. He wanted to discuss the decision over brunch, over lunch, perhaps at his office where he could keep his posture poised and practiced. Evelyn read the letter and did not reply immediately. She made tea, then busied herself with small tasks. The house did not feel empty so much as reordered. The spaces that had once been filled by expectation were now available for choice. 3 days later, a formal note arrived, an attorney's letter requesting mediation. Evelyn read it and handed it to Thomas with the quiet that had become her new voice. "Will they challenge?" she asked. "They might," Thomas said, folding the paper, the corners creasing like cautious hands. "But the structure we've set up is strong. If it's crafted with the right language and protections, contesting it will be difficult." "It's not about the law," Evelyn said. "It's about truth." And truth, she had discovered, was a stubborn thing. When Daniel came for the mediation, he arrived with a representative and the same air of urgency he gave to work calls. He tried to frame the argument around fairness, how money should remain in the family, the practicalities of inheritance, the weight of legal precedent. Evelyn listened as she had learned to listen in the hospital, with attention, but not with the weight of obligation. "Your father left you the house and the accounts with the understanding that you would manage them as heirs," Daniel said. "This abrupt change feels like an awakening," she finished for him. "Yes, it feels like that." The mediators asked for compromise. They suggested a staggered distribution, yearly allowances, a trust administrator of their choosing. Evelyn considered each proposal as if turning a fabric under light. Some folds she smoothed, others she refused. "There is one thing I will not do," she told them. "I will not return to being a safety net for people who treat my presence as optional. If you want to be in my life, show up without being bribed by inheritance. If not, we will rearrange." For the first time, a silence fell that felt like a verdict. It wasn't a shouted courtroom win. It was the steady sound of a woman finally living by the rules she set for herself. Celia's calls swallowed. The next week, pleas softened to bargaining, to the old strategies of guilt and nostalgia. Evelyn read them and let them live in the drawer beside the bank statements. She kept her life uncluttered and precise. The house, which had once held the weight of unasked sacrifice, felt lighter color returned to the curtains, not because the old grief had left, But because she had decided it would no longer cover every surface, one gray afternoon, Evelyn found a letter tucked under the kitchen door like contraband. It was in Celia's handwriting, small and the way one writes when trying to be careful not to hurt someone who is already wounded. Mom, it read, I don't know how to say this except to say that I am sorry. I can't go back and fix the past. I only know I miss Dad in ways that scare me. I am trying. Please, can we meet? Evelyn folded the paper and didn't answer immediately. She set down a cup of tea, the steam rising like a small memory of warmth. She had been waiting not for words, but for actions. A letter did not remove the empty pew. A note couldn't conjure an hour at the graveside or the small human choreography of presence. Later that evening, she sat with Thomas, who read the letter and said, "This changes the tenor of things. If you wanted connection rather than contention, I don't know what I want," Evelyn admitted. "I know what I will tolerate. You could meet," Thomas suggested cautiously. Meet. The word felt like a hinge. She considered all the possible versions of reconciliation. The public apology, the private accounting, the immediate return to obligations. What she wanted was simpler and authentic reach, not a strategic one. "I will meet," she said slowly, "but on conditions." Thomas arched an eyebrow, "Which are face-to-face at my kitchen table. No lawyers. No cameras, where whatever you walked in, sit, listen, and do not deflect. If you apologize, say it plainly. If you mean to ask forgiveness, stand ready to show it with your actions. Don't say, 'I'm sorry.' Say, 'I came because I knew you needed me.'" Thomas nodded slowly, surprised perhaps at the clarity. "I'll send the note." They met 2 days later. Celia appeared with ruby-red cheeks and a small, embarrassed smile. She sat exactly where Evelyn indicated and did not fidgetain effort in self-control. The air between them held all the years the two had not spoken about. Teenage rebellions, the quiet moments of compromise, the days when Evelyn had ferried the family through storms of one kind or another. Celia's voice trembled at first. "Mom, I didn't come to the funeral because I panicked. Seeing Dad like that made me think of my own mortality. I froze. I know it's a poor excuse." Evelyn listened. The words were honest, but they still felt like the first steps in a longer process. She asked questions more specific, practical to measure whether this was a script or a real stitch. "What do you plan to do now?" she asked. "When the trust is set up, how will you visit? How will you be present?" Celia blinked. She had not expected these queries. I can come by Sundays. I can call more. I can be there." Immediacy was easier to promise than pattern. Evelyn waited like a gardener waiting to see if seedlings would root. She told Celia about Ethan and offered an invitation, one conditional on presence. "If you're serious," Evelyn said, "start with simple things. Pick up groceries, drop by without announcing yourself. Be the kind of person who is inconveniently present." Celia wiped at her eyes and nodded. "I can do that." As Celia left, she hugged Evelyn in a way that felt less like grabbing for something and more like a tentative reaching. It was not absolution. It was a start. That night, Evelyn wrote to herself, "Small beginnings. Watch for pattern." She found that she did not want grand theater. She wanted to measure the descent of habit, how quickly old behaviors either returned or were replaced by steady, trustworthy ones. Weeks turned into months, and Celia kept some promises and broke others. Daniel oscillated between gestures and retreats. The legal filings stood firm like a fence. Little by little, Evelyn learned to accept the difference between remorse performed for appearances and remorse that changes how a person shows up in the world. Evelyn's life, newly arranged, began to hold a rhythm of its own. She visited the cemetery, not for closure, but out of devotion. She trimmed the roses with Ethan, taught him how to make pancakes with a small flip that impressed him, and sat in the kitchen with the kettle singing, waiting to see who would come, not for a payout, not for spectacle, but because presence had become the true ledger of worth. In that quiet measuring, she found a strange peace. It was not the hollabom of forgetting, but the steady, slow work of rebuilding life on terms that allowed her to breathe. She had taken the hardest step. She had made her grief a tool. And for the first time, she used it to build rather than to serve as an apology for others. It was early spring when Daniel returned, the world outside just beginning to loosen its winter stiffness. Buds trembled on the lilac bush that Robert had planted decades earlier, and sunlight fell in shy slants across the porch. Evelyn was trimming a branch when she heard tires on gravel. He stepped out of a newer, shinier car this time, dressed not for mourning but for persuasion. A suit in a color that belonged in a boardroom, not at his mother's gate. Still, there was something different about the way he closed the door, as though he already knew the argument had been lost before it began. "Morning, Mom," he said, voice mild. "You look well." Evelyn wiped her hands on her gardening apron. "The roses don't wait for anyone," she said. "What brings you—" He smiled in that rehearsed way she recognized from childhood report cards and grown-up deals. "Thought I'd stop by. See how you're holding up." "I'm holding," she said. "Would you like tea?" Inside, Daniel moved through the house like a man trying to measure its worth. He paused at photographs Robert on the fishing boat, Celia in pigtails, himself in a high school uniform. The silence between them stretched until the kettle whistled dot. He took the cup she offered, then cleared his throat. "Look, Mom, about the estate stuff maybe, we all said things we didn't mean. Lawyers make everything sound harsher than it is." Evelyn set her spoon down. "Your lawyer said exactly what you told him to. Maybe." He looked at his reflection in the tea's surface. "It's just, Ethan's young. What if he wastes it? You worked too hard to see it slip away." "He won't," she said. "He knows the value of things." Daniel smiled faintly. "So did I, once." She studied him. "You still can, Daniel? Value isn't lost. It's misplaced. Find it in something other than money." He looked up, startled by the gentleness in her tone. "You really mean to go through with all this? I already have." The words landed softly, like a gavel wrapped in cloth. He nodded slowly, as though accepting a verdict he couldn't appeal. They talked for another hour, not about accounts or inheritance, but about Robert's old jokes. The time Daniel broke the neighbor's window and swore the baseball had flown on its own. For a moment, he laughed like the boy she remembered. When he left, he hugged her awkwardly, then quickly, as if afraid of what holding too long might reveal. From the window, Evelyn watched his car pull away. She felt neither triumph nor sadness, the strange calm of a woman who had stopped waiting for apologies to rewrite history. The lilac buds outside trembled in the breeze. The season was changing again. That evening, she wrote in her notebook, "He came. He looked human again. That's enough." By May, the house had taken on a rhythm that no longer sounded like absence. The days were practical and full. Morning tea at 7, a walk through the garden. Errands written in her careful looping script. Ethan stopped by most Saturdays, sometimes with paint on his hands. Sometimes with a bag of groceries he insisted on paying for himself. They spoke easily, never circling the old family wounds, choosing instead the sturdy language of projects. One Saturday, he arrived with planks and nails. "We're fixing that porch rail before it gives way," he declared. Evelyn laughed. "You sound like your grandfather." "Then I must be doing something right." They worked through the morning, sawdust catching in their hair. At noon, she brought out sandwiches, and they sat on the steps to eat. The porch smelled of cut wood and sunlight. "You know," Ethan said, mouth full, "Mom asked if I'd talk to you about, undoing things." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "And what did you tell her?" "That you're smarter than any lawyer she can afford." He grinned. She didn't love that. Evelyn chuckled. "Diplomacy never was our family talent." He grew serious. "She's trying, though. I think seeing me here bothers her. Not in a bad way, more like she's realizing what she missed." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Sometimes the mirror shows up late." That afternoon, they finished the railing, and Ethan stood back, proud. "Look straight to me," he said. "Your grandfather would have said it leans just enough to remind us we're human," she replied. He laughed, wiping his hands. "Then it's perfect." When he left, Evelyn stayed on the porch, tracing the new grain with her fingers. The wood felt warm, alive. It struck her that healing was built from such small victories, boards aligned. Letters written, mornings survived without bitterness. None of it grand, all of it essential. That evening, she cooked real food, again roast chicken with rosemary. The recipe Robert used to request when guests came. She ate slowly, savoring not the taste but the silence that followed each bite. It was a silence she had earned. Later, a knock came. Brenda, her neighbor, with lemon bars and gossip. "I saw the new railing," Brenda said. "Looks good. You're handy." "Credit to my apprentice," Evelyn said. "Ethan's been helping." Brenda smiled knowingly. "That boy's got your steadiness, not his mother's hurry." They sat, eating lemon bars and watching the light fade. Brenda talked about her own grown children, about how distance sometimes felt like weather. You could predict it, endure it, but not control it. Evelyn listened, feeling less alone than she had in years. When Brenda left, she lingered by the doorway. She said, "People in town still talk about the funeral. How strong you were." Evelyn shook her head. "Strength is a funny word, Brenda. It's not lifting something heavy. It's putting something down and letting it stay down." Brenda nodded, eyes glistening. Then you're the strongest woman I know. After she left, Evelyn went to her desk and opened the drawer where she kept her notebook. She wrote a new line under the day's date. Today I built something that will outlast guilt. The porch stands straight enough. So do I. She closed the book, turned off the lamp, and listened to the quiet house breathe around her. The air smelled of sawdust and lemon. Somewhere outside, the roses were thinking about blooming again. Spring loosened the world in slow, practical ways. The maple at the end of Evelyn Street leafed into full green. Shopkeepers swapped heavier coats for lighter scarves. Even the morning light felt kinder, as if it had learned how to touch things without making them ache. Evelyn found herself noticing small mercies. The way sunlight pooled on the kitchen floor at 7, the soft weight of a well-made cup of tea, the honest sound of someone's laugh when it arrived without asking for anything in return. She began to fill her days with things she had once postponed for others. There were pottery classes on Tuesday afternoons. She had always liked how the wheel turned under her palms, the way a messy lump could take shape and become something useful. At the studio, she sat between two women who cheered when she smudged clay along a rim and then winked when the vase still came out handsome. The teacher, a woman with paint under her fingernails and a laugh that reminded Evelyn of warm bread, taught them that imperfection often made things more human. Evelyn discovered a silly, new satisfaction in small domestic experiments. She learned to fold napkins in ways that made tea feel like a ceremony again. She bought a small radio and learned to catch an old program Robert liked. Sometimes she made a pot of soup and sat with it while the host talked about trains in faraway places. These little rituals weren't compensation. They were reclamation. They restored the quiet dignity of a life lived for oneself. Ethan's visits continued to anchor the week. He arrived one Wednesday evening dragging a cardboard box that smelled faintly of paint and old books. He set it at Evelyn's feet and crawled onto the armchair with boyish ease. Found this at the community center, old repair manuals. Thought we could make a shelf. They built the shelf on the second Saturday in May. Wood, nails, and the careful way to people who care for a house speak without using words. Evelyn taught him the little tricks Robert had taught her. How to sand until the grain looked like silk. How to stagger nails for strength. How to measure twice and cut once. Ethan listened like someone learning something sacred rather than merely useful. When they were done, he stepped back and smiled the way people do when they surprise themselves into pride. "We did good," he said. "We always do," Evelyn answered, though the truth of it had finally shifted toward being something she could honestly claim for herself. The town began to notice the changes to active neighbors who had once assumed Evelyn's role as the default helper, now saw a woman who kept boundaries. Lorraine waved from her porch with a new mixture of admiration and relief. Brenda stopped by with a casserole and stayed to sit on the steps while the world turned. "You look younger," she said once, blunt and pleased. "A little less like you're carrying the whole world." Evelyn thought about that. Maybe I stopped carrying things that weren't mine. There were small invitations she accepted. An art fair with people who smelled of oil and glue. A community meeting where she raised her hand to speak about a small grant for the library. She surprised herself by enjoying the attention and then letting it go like a ribbon, not clutching it, not requiring it to be the whole of her worth. One late afternoon, she found a packet of old letters in a shoebox. Notes Robert had written during early work trips when they were still learning how to be married without knowing the map for it. She sat at the kitchen table and read them with a soft smile, the edges of memory folding gently back into place. They were ordinary, loving, a kind of steady that had taught her how to keep a life in repair. Tears came quiet, private-hand, then she wiped them without ceremony. Grief, she had learned, no longer needed to be a lodestone. It could be a weather pattern. Noticeable, but not ill. On a bright Saturday morning, the town held a festival in the square music stalls. The smell of frying donuts. Evelyn walked through it with Ethan at her side, carrying a paper cup of coffee. She listened to a singer whose voice was like both salt and sugar. She bought a small handloom scarf from a woman who insisted she try it on right there. People greeted her and she greeted them back, neither looking for pity nor carrying a billboard of tragedy. She found herself smiling more readily, surprised at how natural it felt. That evening, as she stood at her kitchen window watching the square's lights dim, she realized she had reclaimed days not by striking dramatic blows, but by living small, honest triumphs. The house hummed softly with life her life and the echo felt generous rather than hollow. She brewed tea, sat at the table, and added a line to a notebook she kept by the lamp. "Today I laughed. Today I built. Today I chose myself again." Joy wasn't a single thunderclap of comeback. It was the patient accumulation of tiny choices that said, over and over, I will come for myself. And day by day, that quiet repetition grew until the sound of it was almost a new kind of music. The knock came on a Tuesday that started ordinary and then tilted. Evelyn had just set a pot of soup to simmer and was arranging a small bouquet in a cleared vase when she heard the soft, somehow unfamiliar tap at the door. At first, she thought it might be Lorraine. Neighbors dropped by more often now. She wiped her hands on a towel and opened the door. Meredith stood there, jacket buttoned at the throat, a pie in a box held carefully as if it were a fragile peace offering. She was Peter's wife. Always precise, always composed in that way. Professional women practice like armor up close. Meredith looked smaller than in photos, less the polished accessory to someone's success, and more like a woman carrying a life of her own with a tired, polite steadiness. Hello, Mrs. Grant, Meredith said, voice of practiced warmth. I hope this isn't a bad time. Evelyn stepped aside. It's not. Come in. Meredith's hands fluttered with the pie box. Then she set it on the counter as if she could transfer something from the outside world into the house with the exchange. I brought this for you. Evelyn inclined her head. Thank you. They moved into the kitchen where light fell across the counter in a forgiving ribbon. Meredith sat at the table like someone feeling their way into unfamiliar conversation. I'm not sure how to start, she said. I wanted to say on behalf of Peter, I'm sorry for everything that happened around your husband, for not being there. Evelyn studied her. There was no performative flourish, no attempt to spin comfort into currency. Just a small, tentative apology made human. It was distinct from the angry, entitled approaches she'd weathered. It came from an angle she had not anticipated, humility rather than defense. You're not the one I'm angry with, Evelyn said softly. You married into habits. You may not have known how deep they ran, but thank you for coming. Meredith drew a breath she had been holding. He's complicated, she said, and sometimes she paused, searching for the word. I didn't know how to get through to him, but I saw you those last weeks. You were steady in a way that made the rest of us look small. It embarrassed me. Evelyn's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Steadiness can be mistaken for complacency, she replied. Only the people who really watch can tell the difference. Meredith nodded, wiping at her eyes with a finger. I wanted to ask for advice, she said. Not about the house or money, I have no right to that, but about how you stayed calm. How you decided. Evelyn thought about the years' times of quiet decisions, of choosing where to spend energy, of deciding when to be present and when presence itself became a liability. She thought about the garden pruned in winter and the shelf built with patient hands. You start small, she said. You do one honest thing every day. Then another, and you notice whether people return it. If they don't, you stop expecting them to. Meredith listened like a pupil. When she left, she hugged Evelyn, and in that brief contact, there was a sense of repair that didn't depend on apologies alone. It felt like two women recognizing the shape of what it takes to hold a life steady. Word of Meredith's visit traveled slowly. As town talk does less gossip and more, the quiet rediscovery that people who appeared monolithic are often complicated, caught between duty and self-preservation. Daniel called the following day, voiced lukewarm. He asked if they might meet not to negotiate but to talk. Evelyn agreed to a short tea in the garden. When Daniel arrived, carried a hesitant candor that had begun to shift into something less theatrical. They sat at the small patio table beneath the wisteria, and for the first time he spoke without a shield of busyness. I wanted to say I'm trying to be better, he said simply. It's clumsy, but I mean it. Evelyn watched him. The man who had once excused absence with syntax now offered an attempt at presence. She listened, letting him speak until his words settled not into absolution but into plausible intent. Show me, she told him finally. Let me see evidence. Little things. That's all I ask. He nodded, as if grateful for the narrowness of the request. I will, he said. The days that followed were not perfect. Promises frayed, slipped, then were mended with small, sometimes awkward acts. A call that came at an hour he'd not used before. A box of groceries left at the door. A quiet offer to help with a heavy appliance. It wasn't a sweep of redemption. It was the slow arithmetic of habit changing. Evelyn kept her guard, as she had learned to do. But she also watched for the human gestures beneath the legal letters and defensive replies. When people changed, she wanted to see it stick. When they did not, she would not let it unmake her dot in the garden, under the new railing and the newer leaves. She found herself laughing at a joke Ethan told loud, and surprised Dan thought, with a small, fierce joy, that her house was no longer a quiet ledger of duties. It had become a place where small, honest lives visited one another and where steady enough was Finally, enough. Summer came with a warm insistence that felt almost intrusive after so many quiet months. The roses bloomed wildly, their petals heavy and unapologetic, spilling against the fence like proof that life did, in fact, go on. Evelyn woke early these days before the world got noisy and made coffee strong enough to taste like conviction. The house felt less like a memory and more like something breathing. Alongside her, it was Ethan's idea first. He had stopped by one afternoon, sweat-streaked from mowing the lawn, and said between gulps of lemonade, "You know, Grandma, this garden's kind of magic. You could share it, Evelyn asked. "Yeah," he said, gesturing to the small patch of vegetables and the rows of roses. "There's this program at the community center, Adopt a Plot. People who don't have yards. Come learn to grow things. You could host a few. You've got more than enough space." Evelyn looked out at the garden. The thought startled her not because it was unappealing, but because she realized she had never considered her space as something that could expand outward without being taken from her. She had always associated sharing with depletion, but this sounded like multiplication. "Let me think on it," she said. That night, she stood by the window watching the fireflies rise over the yard. The idea sat in her chest like a small flame. For years, her home had been a vessel for obligation where bills arrived, where needs collected, where expectations nested. Perhaps it could be something else now, a place that gave without being consumed the next morning. She called Brenda. "I'm thinking of letting the community use the back garden," she said. Brenda's reaction was immediate. "Finally, you've been growing enough basil to feed a parish." They laughed, and by the following week, 3 volunteers from the community program came to tour the space. Evelyn guided them through rows of herbs, overgrown mint, and the stubborn tomato plants that had survived defrosts. They were younger, eager, and spoke in the excited shorthand of people who believed in small miracles. By the end of the visit, they had arranged a plan for raised beds, for vegetables, 2 for flowers, 1 for experiments. Evelyn stood at the edge of her yard as they left, a sense of quiet thrill unfolding inside her. When the group returned a few days later, she had already labeled the beds with neat wooden signs. She handed each volunteer a pair of gloves from Robert's old tool shed. "They're worn, but they still do the job," she said. The laughter that followed felt easy. Natural. Over the next weeks, the backyard changed its rhythm. There was chatter where there had once been silence, laughter where there had been static. Children came on Saturdays with their parents to dig small holes, their giggles cutting through the hum of summer insects. Even Brenda began stopping by with lemonade, claiming to supervise, though she mostly gossiped and swatted at flies. Ethan, now taller, stronger, took the role of unofficial foreman. He taught the children how to space seedlings and used twine to guide the climbing beans. Evelyn watched him, her heart swelling with something that didn't feel like pride alone. It was recognition. He was building something, not just growing plants. She caught herself one evening, standing in the doorway watching the golden dusk settle over the garden, thinking, Robert would have loved this. He would have called it messy and perfect. And she smiled. Later that night, she sat at the kitchen table and opened her notebook. On a fresh page, she wrote, "The measure of a good life is what grows after you stop guarding everything you've earned." The next morning, the first small tomato ripened round red whole. She plucked it, sliced it, and shared half with Ethan when he stopped by. "First harvest," she said. He grinned. "You sure you want to share it?" Evelyn laughed. "I'm learning." The garden's success spread quietly, the way honest things often do. Neighbors began leaving handwritten notes on Evelyn's mailbox requests to visit, to donate seeds, to learn how she kept the roses alive despite the summer heat. Someone from the local paper called it the Widow's Garden, a name she disliked for its sentimentality, but she admitted it drew curiosity. She told them if they must write about it, at least mention that it was a space for growing resilience. They did. Soon, there were 6 regular volunteers and a rotation of neighborhood children who arrived with mismatched gloves and wide eyes. Saturdays smelled of soil, lemon balm, and Brenda's habitual cinnamon rolls. Evelyn had not planned to become a teacher, but the rhythm of giving knowledge felt different from giving money. Teaching didn't drain her. It returned something. On one of those bright, endless afternoons, Ethan arrived with a box of small flags. "What are those?" she asked. "Markers," he said, tapping each stake. "For everyone to write something they've learned this season." He handed her a marker, and she thought for a moment before writing, "Things bloom when tended." Knocked and manded, she pressed the flag into the soil beside the rosemary bush. Others followed children's scrawls, adults' careful phrases. By dusk, The garden looked like a small field of declarations waving gently in the breeze. That evening, the volunteers proposed hosting a gathering, not a big event. They promised just a thank you. Evelyn hesitated, then agreed on one condition. No speeches, no spotlights, just good food and honest laughter. Brenda took charge of planning, which meant half the town would somehow end up invited anyway. The celebration came on a Sunday, bathed in forgiving sunlight. Tables were set up under the old oak, draped in borrowed tablecloths. There were pies, salads, and dishes labeled with recipes that had more heart than precision. Children darted between flower beds, their laughter like punctuation marks in the air. Ethan set up a string of lights from the porch to the fence, and when dusk fell, they glowed like captured fireflies. Evelyn moved through it all with the ease of someone who no longer felt like she had to host to be loved. People came not because they wanted something from her, but because they had found something through her. They thanked her, hugged her, pressed her hand. Some called her Miss Evelyn, some Mrs. Grant, some just Eve. Each name carried a small sincerity that no title of benefactor or mother had ever truly held. When the music began, an old record player someone had dug up from the community center, Brenda pulled her into a dance. Evelyn laughed so hard she nearly forgot to protest. The song crackled but carried rhythm enough for them to sway and spin. Two women who had lived long enough to know that joy didn't have to be graceful to be true. Later, as the crowd thinned and the lights flickered low, Evelyn sat at the edge of the porch steps beside Ethan. The garden shimmered under the soft glow. A patchwork of color and movement. She could hear Brenda humming near the sink, cleaning dishes despite orders not to. And somewhere a child was still chasing the last lightning bug. "Grandma," Ethan said quietly, "this place. It feels like him." Evelyn smiled. "It is him. It's me too. Maybe even you." They sat in comfortable silence. The night smelled of basil and dew. It was then that Evelyn realized something that made her chest ache and settle all at once. She no longer thought of her life as something she was recovering from. It had become something she was still making. When the last guest left, she stood in the doorway, looking at the lanterns swaying gently above the garden. She thought of Robert, of the children who were still learning how to see her, of the young ones who now came to dig and plant. She thought of the woman she had been at that funeral, silent, invisible, diminished, and felt an odd tenderness toward her. That version of Evelyn had needed to break so that this one could bloom. Before going to bed, she opened her notebook again and wrote one more line beneath the others. Peace isn't silence. It's the sound of life going on around you, and the grace of knowing you no longer need to fix it. She closed the book, placed it beside her lamp, and smiled. Outside, the lanterns burned on, steady and golden, lighting a small patch of the world she had made whole again. Late autumn brought a thin, steady rain that made the porch smell like wet wood and old promises. Evelyn was inside, sleeves rolled up, folding a shirt Robert had worn to 1,000 unremarkable Sunday dinners. The house hummed with a comfortable, quiet, soft radio in the background, kettle warming on the stove. The garden, sleeping under a coat of last roses and leaf mulch. The knock came hard enough to make her straighten. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door before she had time to decide whether she wanted to. Standing there, dripping from the rain and breathless with something like urgency, was Celia. Celia looked different in a way that was difficult to name. Not older, not merely weary, closer to a woman whose lines had been carved by impatience and then softened by regret. Her makeup was smudged as if she'd paid for the face she wore and then found the cost too heavy. "Mom," she said, the name raw. "Can I come in?" Evelyn hesitated less than she would have a year before. She stepped aside. They sat opposite one another at the kitchen table as if resuming school chairs. The rain made a soft percussion on the roof. Celia folded her hands together until the knuckles paled. Celia started, then stopped. She opened and closed her mouth like someone trying to find a shape that fit the words. "I need to tell you something. Not to ask forgiveness. But, so you know, Daniel, he left. He didn't tell me at first. It happened fast." The words landed like cold stones. Evelyn's face didn't change. She had years of steady now. The container that held her in storms. Celia's voice rushed on. "I didn't understand so many things until then. I was lost. I saw how I treated you, how I treated him. I didn't come to the funeral because I was ashamed. And ashamed people hide. I thought if I stayed small, nothing would change. It did. He left with someone from his office. They said it was for his career. She broke off, the rest collapsing into the sound of rain. Evelyn listened. There was no triumph in this moment, no satisfaction at witnessing consequence. She felt instead the complex human ache of two people who had missed one another's lives in different ways. One by indifference, one by denial, both by habit. "Why are you telling me now?" Evelyn asked gently. Celia's hands shook. "Because I saw a lot when the curtains closed. I saw Ethan. I saw you standing at the hospice, steady as a rock. I saw Daniel calling and not showing up for the things that really mattered. I thought, maybe I can change. I don't want to be the woman who regrets everything." The admission was small and immediate. It did not erase the empty pews or the months of absence, but it opened a door that had been shut with slammed pride and excuses. Evelyn considered the usual ledger of apologies and promises. She had seen them all. The one-line texts, the urgent brunch invitations that smelled of performative guilt. But this was not a performative visit. There was no lawyer at her side. No camera. Celia had come wet and honest. "Do you want to stay?" Evelyn asked. Celia looked up, startled. "For a while," she said. "If you'll have me." Evelyn nodded. "Then we'll set small things. Show up on Thursdays, bring groceries, sit, start without trying to fix what's been broken." Celia's face softened into something like relief. She reached across the table and took Evelyn's hand, a simple contact that held no grand promises but contained a seed of something practical and tender. Outside, the rain eased to the soft hush of November. Inside, the kettle sang. Two women sat at a table, learning the shape of an imperfect reconciliation, one practical step at a time. The weeks that followed were not a sudden cure. They were a seamstress's steady stitches, sometimes crooked, sometimes perfect, always mending. Celia arrived on Thursdays with groceries and a willingness to sit. Sometimes she cried in the kitchen and spoke of her fear. Sometimes she brought a casserole and hardly spoke at all. Daniel called occasionally with a voice that wavered between pride and shame. Once he showed up to fix a gutter, sleeves rolled, looking clumsy and genuine in equal measure. Evelyn watched without hurry. She measured change the way she had learned to measure soil pH, small tests over time, not grand experiments. When Celia accidentally left a receipt for a spa day on the counter, Evelyn could have flared and dosed the moment with righteous judgment. Instead, she asked, "Did you enjoy it?" Celia flushed. "Yes." "Then that's good." Evelyn's voice was small. Brick by joy is allowed. There were harder moments. A late-night call from Daniel Langry, blaming the lawyer, blaming his wife for not fixing what he called family dynamics. He asked Evelyn to reverse the trust, to consider fairness, to imagine the scandal. Evelyn sat with the accusation like a stone in her palm, heavy and inert. "I made a decision," she told him. "It was for the life my husband and I built. It's not about punishment. It's about stewardship." There was silence on the line like a held breath. "You're cold," Daniel said at last. "Maybe," Evelyn answered, "or maybe I'm finally clear." One afternoon, Celia brought Ethan by. He burst through the door with the sort of single-minded cheerfulness only young adults develop, practical, kind, and unself-conscious. He hugged Evelyn and then, with the tact of someone grounded, asked if she needed help clearing out the shed. They worked together sweeping, organizing, finding the tools Robert had used for years. Ethan tinkered with an old radio, coaxing music back to life as they worked. The sound filled the shed and then the kitchen, and then the whole house as if proof that small mending could become loud with joy. Evelyn looked at Celia across the kitchen, watching her fold old linens gently, and felt a complicated gratitude. She would not heap roses on the past or pretend the wrongs had not been wrong, but she watched the visible labor of repair, the acts of showing up and let them weigh more than words. As winter threatened, the family's interactions grew into a pattern of imperfect presence. Celia helped with grocery runs and, on one Sunday, rolled up her sleeves and planted bulbs in the front border. Daniel, who still had a long way to learn, came by 2 Saturdays in a row to help fix a leaky valve and left with his hands dirty, and a quiet look on his face that said he was thinking about the kind of man he wanted to be. Evelyn did not announce forgiveness. She did not broadcast redemption. Instead, she measured by return. Did people come when it mattered now? Did they offer steady acts that suggested a change deeper than speech? Over time, the ledger of presence began to rewrite itself in small, living entries. One evening, as snow dusted the porch and the kettle hummed like a contented animal, Evelyn sat with Celia and Daniel at the kitchen table. No lawyers, no lists, just a steaming pot of tea and the small comfort of shared warmth. They spoke like people learning a language of seeing one another again. It was imperfect and messy and human. As they left that night, Celia hugged Evelyn and said, quiet and earnest, "I'm sorry. Mom, I am trying." Evelyn watched them go and felt the house settle into a kind of cautious hope. There would be more test temptations to old fault lines, New mistakes, human failings. But for the first time in years, she felt the possibility of something new taking root. Not a family, perfectly whole, but one learning to show up. On a pale morning that smelled faintly of cinnamon and thaw, Evelyn took pen to paper and wrote a letter not for the court, not for a loud declaration, but for the small, private ledger of her heart. It would be the last thing she tucked into the drawer of the kitchen desk beside Robert's old fountain pen and the stack of postcards he never sent. Dear Evelyn, she wrote, her handwriting deliberate and calm. You tried longer than you should have. You gave until the seams of your life frayed. You kept the lights on and folded the shirts and answered the calls. You forgave more than you were owed. She paused and let the kettle whistle. The pause felt like permission. You did not fail in your care. You failed to see that care could be returned. You kept being the safe place until it was all you were. Today, you are something else too. You are a woman who knows her worth is not a currency to be spent at others' convenience. You invented a garden where people learned to grow. You built a shelf and a porch and taught someone how to hammer straight. You refused to let your last gifts be swallowed by absence. She wrote of the little victories. The first tomato, the repaired railing, the Saturday mornings with Ethan, the trust that kept the home safe. She wrote of the slow, stubborn work of watching people change, of distinguishing performative apologies from real, repetitive acts. She wrote about mercy measured by presence. If you wake and feel the old habit tug, she wrote, remember the roses. They were pruned and now they bloomed for you. Remember the boy who showed up without asking for a payout? Remember that peace is not absence of noise, but the right noise. Laughter, tools, cups of tea, honest confession. She closed with a small, sharp kindness. Do not let the past make you small. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to choose joy over obligation. When you grow weary, stand in the doorway and breathe. You are enough. You are steady. You are loved. Evelyn folded the note and tucked it into the drawer. It was not a manifesto or a trumpet blast. It was a lamp placed on a shelf to light the next room she would enter. She placed the pen beside it, the old ink, a small reservoir against future doubt. That afternoon, she walked out to the garden and found Ethan painting the fence a soft cream. He looked up and grinned. Want to help? She took the brush without hesitation. The paint smelled like possibility. They worked in companionable silence, and when they were done, they stepped back to admire how the color brightened the yard and made the house look like an invitation instead of a ledger. Evelyn thought of the funeral, of the empty pew, of the way the world had tested her. She felt no triumph, only the quiet truth that she had chosen a life and tended it. The house, the garden, the letters. The small, steady people who came unbidden. They were her testament now. The winter sky loosened slightly. The gray softened to a pale blue. She wiped her hands on a rag, felt the slight sting of chilled skin, and smiled. Somewhere down the street, someone was walking a dog. A child laughed. A radio played a song Robert had loved. It all sounded ordinary and perfect. She went inside, made tea, and set a slice of toast on a plate, one for herself, one for a future guest. Then she sat at the kitchen table, opened the drawer, read the note again, and let herself be exactly where she was, repaired, careful, and quietly, gloriously whole.